thank you all so much for being here and learning about what tech leaders need to know about microservices. It's gonna
Microservices.
be fantastic. So my name is Leslie Chapman. I am a distinguished engineer at Comcast. What does that mean? It means I get to write code, and I don't have to worry about much other than that. So it's kind of like the best job in the entire universe. And this story that we're going to walk you through and this explanation that we're going to walk you through is like super near and dear to my heart because we are going through this right now on my team. So get ready.
All right, and I'm Michael Winslow, and just as a homage to Philadelphia, I'm going to do the classic DJ Jazzy Jeff and Fresh Prince stance and say, she's the coder, I'm the manager. So, so I'm a director at Comcast. I'm what's called used to be a coder, and my fun fact is I still code just for management tasks. So I try to do it in a way that my leader doesn't realize that it's a coded report that he gets, but he's just like, wow, you're just so detail-oriented in your report. I'm like, yeah, it's generated. You know? So feel free to keep in touch with us on our Twitter or LinkedIn, and I think we'll get started. You want to get started? All right. Tell everybody, tell the nice people about Comcast.
So Comcast is in Philadelphia. Right downtown, we work in a sparkly new building. It's kind of amazing. It's called the Comcast Technology Center. And it's just full of like a ton of nerds, which is super fun. We have a gym and a cafeteria, which is super fun. Mm-hmm. And we build amazing products that millions of people use every night when they go home and relax. And while a lot of people might think, it's just television. It's not. It's kind of your friend, right? Come on, you can all admit it. Who loves their TV? Come on. Yeah. All right. So it's the most fulfilling job in the universe.
It is. We love it.
And we have a huge footprint that you guys probably don't even know is our footprint. You guys know about Comcast as a cable provider. You probably know about us as a high-speed data provider. We have a lot of apps that you can use to interact with your X-Fi, I'm sorry, with your high-speed data. But a lot of people don't know we recently got into the mobile business. We also have Comcast Spotlight, which does advertising for local businesses in the Philadelphia region. Freewheel, which is advertising. There's too much that's gonna go on the slide. I can't explain it all.
All right, let's just kind of, and then how did we expand recently? Who did we buy?
Sky, yeah. Kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
And we have all these networks that people don't know about. We employ engineers far beyond software engineers, mechanical engineers at our Universal theme parks. And one of the things that people don't really realize about Comcast is we are a technology company, we're not a cable company. So yes. Let's just dispel that myth.
Absolutely, absolutely. And in true DevOps form, we don't like this chart for one main reason. This is what we want the chart to look more like. All those lines disappearing, right? There should be no difference. We should be able to talk across all those lines. And we work every day to try to make sure that those lines get blurred and then eventually go away. Yes. All right. Now it comes to me.
I'm going to hand it over to him. He's the DevOps guy. I'm just here for the sizzle.
I'm not sure how I got that moniker at Comcast, but recently I've been known as the DevOps guy all the time. So I've been coming to DevOps meetups and different events for years and years. Last year was my first time at DevOps Enterprise Summit, and now I am completely honored to be up here. I'm a huge DevOps fan. I always thought that the name DevOps was the one thing that I kind of didn't like because it does make you think it's just about dev and ops. And it's so much more than that. This is the third day, you guys have probably heard this many times before. What I like is the acronym that John Willis and Damon Edwards came up with was CAMS. They've expanded it to CALMS recently with Jez Humble, but I like to keep things simple, and I don't take on new letters unless I have to. And so it's culture, automation, measurement, which is like the thing that so many people forget about here, and then sharing. So we gave you ideas of how we want to share on the previous slide. We want to make sure that we share between companies, but I think this describes my thought of DevOps so much more than the word DevOps itself. So you're here for microservices. We're going to go through some fun slides here. A little bit of background about how I came up originally with this deck, and then we worked on it together. So I started as a principal engineer at Xfinity Mobile. I'm sorry. That's a lot smaller than I thought it would be down there. I'll just read along with you guys then. One day, the team decided to move to microservices, and we grew fast, and then I ended up taking a leadership role. And when I was in the leadership role, I talked to one of my upstream leaders, and I said, by the way, for the last 2 months on our timesheets, we've been putting microservices. Do you know what microservices are? You know? And he said, no. And I said, what do you do if your boss asks you, what's this microservices thing? He's like, I'll just say the engineers told me we had to do it. So
That doesn't sound good.
it doesn't sound great. So I started off, this whole deck started off as a way to teach my leader what microservices are. So we're going to go through it. So I had 2 unique perspectives because of this leadership role that I took. I thought that microservices would be cool because it's cool tech, but I also wanted it to prove out its business value. So when we made this change to microservices, things in the end worked out well, but it wasn't always sunshine. So this is the part that I love. I get to help the audience be more interactive here. We get to make a choice here. Would you rather hear about the lessons that we learned along the way moving to microservices, or do you just want to hear about how great the team was? Red pill or blue pill? Sorry, this is my presentation, and there's no way I would come up here and not talk about what a great team we had putting together microservices. I promise we'll keep it short. This is my favorite t-shirt that I always wear around, and you guys saw me in it last night if you did it. And it was just such a great, amazing team that put it together. And one thing I definitely want to point out is that this was part of my lightning talk, so it has the 15-second timer, the diversity of the team. I mean, and I talk about all kinds of diversity. There's like an old guy there, right? So
Michael, I'm old.
You're old, and you're actually not in there, so sorry about that.
But seriously, microservices. So I don't know what that means.
Gotcha. And so a quote that I like to use, you mind if I stand over here for a second? This kind of feels like it's in the way. So my uncle and one of my first mentors had a great quote where he said, a true seasoned professional should be able to speak for 5 minutes intelligently about any subject. That has kind of been something that I've carried with me all my life. I don't know how many times you sat down for the first time with somebody and they talked about a subject that you had never heard about before, and you just decided, I don't know anything about it, I'm not interested. That's not me. You know, I want to get my 5 minutes in and figure out from that person how I can speak intelligently about that. And that's how I felt when I wanted to make this deck for my leader that didn't know about microservices.
So Michael.
Yes.
By the way, I am playing the role of the leader that doesn't know. I actually do know what a microservice is, but for the purposes of this talk, I do not.
Absolutely.
So Michael, why do we need to do this? What's this going to bring to our business? What's the difference between a monolith and a microservice?
Glad you asked. So monolith versus microservice. These are the words you always hear going around. Many of you actually know this already, but I'm going to do it for the couple of people who won't admit that they don't know it. So we used to call this thing just a service, right? Then all of a sudden when microservices came around, this thing that was just a normal service before was given the moniker the monolith, all right? And what is the monolith? The monolith takes in a call from an HTTP request. It comes to a controller. That controller calls a service, which has the business logic in it. That service calls a repository of some kind. And that repository normally would go to a database, but sometimes may go to other services. Okay? And in your controller, you would define all kinds of endpoints. In this case, eligibility, user, and device. And if you're writing code in a very systematic way, you will have matching business logic for all of those that come in, and possibly even exact matching repository layers, which matches 3 particular tables that you might have in your database. Okay? Of course, there's variation that can happen, but this is a good example of a standard monolith. Okay, so this little thing is a microservice. But I want you to be aware that just because it's called a microservice doesn't mean that it's physically smaller than the monolith you would have started with. Many times you have so much boilerplate code in a microservice that the actual file size could be larger than the monolith that you started with. And that definitely was the case in our case. So HTTP requests would come into a microservice, and it would, instead of hitting a controller that had all the endpoints in it, it would have a very specific controller that had that one endpoint for device. And then it looks very similar as it goes down and has its own data store. Like I said, things vary along the way, but this is a typical example of a microservice. All right? And then we would have 2 more microservices to represent the other items that we had in eligibility and user. Okay. So, you start to understand what a microservice is.
Yeah, but here's the thing. So I think what you're saying is we have all these people on this team, and we can just kind of break them off and have them work on microservices?
You're getting it. So this might be a reason to move to microservices. You have a great number of developers, and they keep stepping on each other's foot in the microservice. You might want to break those teams up and give them independent projects to work on. Okay, so let's move this to the side a little bit and talk about a challenge that you have when you move to microservices. If you remember what we had in the monolith, there was one particular HTTP endpoint that would come in, and you could use that to go to several different endpoints. Okay? If you notice the diagram of the microservices, you actually have 3 very unique services here, and when you're actually migrating users over, you can't tell them, instead of calling one particular endpoint, call 3. So you need a traffic cop there. You need to add a gateway in there. Okay? Now, we used Netflix Zool as a gateway at the time. Just to let you know, API gateway in Amazon is the equivalent to what you would build out yourself with Netflix Zool. Okay, and Zool is open source API gateway. We all know what that is. All right. Any questions?
Is this going to scale? I mean, our monolith is working. Why are we messing with it? Are we going to be able to deliver on the same cadence? Is this going to take us longer?
I'm glad you asked. Okay, let's say, for example, that eligibility microservice that you have starts getting traffic that way outpaces the rest of your microservices. What you can do with microservices is go ahead and just add 2 more eligibility microservices at this point. Okay, and what you're going to need to do at that point is discover that there are new microservices there. Okay, if you're still using the Netflix stack, you're going to use something called Eureka to do this. All right, and if you're on the Amazon side, Amazon uses ECS for its service discovery and several other things that you can put into Amazon as well. All right, so once it discovers there's 2 new eligibility microservices there, it decides that it's going to expand that gateway and register them behind that gateway so that it can start taking on traffic. And that's when Netflix Ribbon comes in. Netflix Ribbon is the ability to say, I want to make sure that I evenly balance the load of eligibility calls between my 3 eligibility microservices. Okay? In Amazon, they use Elastic Load Balancer. Okay. So,
what happens when traffic just gets, how do we really load balance this? And what happens if one of those nodes goes down?
Oh, I'm glad you asked. Fault tolerance and the circuit breaker pattern. Let's talk about it. Okay, let's say the database for one of your eligibility microservices decides to fail, and then that causes the microservice to fail. Okay, we might retry once, retry twice, retry 3 times, and then you're going to want to say something that says, I want this out of my mix. Cheerio, goodbye. Hystrix is what handles that. On the Netflix stack, it's basically graceful fault tolerance. It will take the one eligibility out of the rotation. If you're hand-rolling your own, sometimes you may actually have to start up another eligibility microservice yourself. As in all things on Amazon, it's basically just a check of a box. That it would handle it all for you on AWS.
Okay, this is sounding really great. So what you've told me so far is that we can be super fault tolerant. We can take this big team that we already have, and we can assign them out to work on these microservices. So it's not really going to be a hit to my productivity. Where's the but?
Where's the but? Well, that's a great breakdown of what you've learned so far. So now I think we should let the audience decide. Would you rather have us tell us what our team learned, or have us tell you what our team learned? Red or blue, guys? Red. All right, this time you got me. You got this. We're gonna do it. All right. So, if you go out there and you're trying to start your journey on microservices, you might find a few very snarky comments out on the internet, and I'd like to show you one of them when I first started looking out. It was a great flow chart, which was a decision maker on whether or not you should move to microservices, and it looks something like this. Are you Netflix? No. So that was a joke back then. It's still kind of a joke, but there are definitely great and a lot of use cases to move to microservices. But a lot of people make a mistake when they jump in too soon. Okay, I want to quote another friend of mine, a developer that was on Xfinity Mobile when we did this. Complexity begets complexity. Soon, tools are needed to manage the complexity. Then tools are needed to manage the tools. I thought that was awesome, so I decided to put it in here. And if you ever want to talk to him about his quote, R. Emerly is how it's pronounced. All right, cool.
Here's the thing. I think our Splunk costs went up.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh.
How are we gonna figure this out?
All right, maybe we can figure out how that happened with microservices. Let's take an example here. We need to call our API to determine if a particular user is eligible to purchase a device. This is a very good example and a very real-world example. First, the scoreboard's up top, guys. All right, on your left, my right, this is a monolith, and here's how that would happen. These dots will come in, they represent process boundaries. And every time we cross a process boundary, we're going to make a syslog entry. So the red dots are the syslog entries. So the HTTP request comes into the eligibility microservice. It goes to the service layer. It calls the user service, and it goes to the database. We have made 2 hits. Then we need to find out, we got the user information. Now we want to get the information about the device to find out if they are eligible for that device. So, a lot of paraphrasing here, but let's say we have 3 process boundary jumps, 3 syslog entries. All right. Now, on the microservices side, the first thing that you're going to notice, a lot more process boundaries between the microservices. So we come into the API gateway. That's 1. Eligibility call. That's 2. Eligibility does its processing, calls the user microservice. It comes out of the gateway because that's the pattern that's usually followed. Okay? And then it goes to the database. We're really building them up here, aren't we? Then we got to go to the device, and we got to go to the database, okay? So for the same thing in a microservice, you've caused 6 syslog entries to 3, okay? Also, we don't get into this very much, but the increased process boundaries also create more surface layer for possible security threats.
All right, so I was feeling real great about this earlier, but now you're making me a little worried. How can we make sure it's all worth it?
Calm down, boss.
Okay.
All right? We're going to be fine.
All right.
Okay, but I got to be honest with you, we're not done with the logs conversation yet.
Fair enough.
So, application logs.
Please tell me more.
Okay, so let's talk about how we used to troubleshoot in production. How did we find out that things were going wrong? So using that same scenario, you come into the eligibility microservice, and it tries to go to the user database, and it's a failure right there. Has anybody ever seen anything that looks like this?
I'm taking off my boss hat and putting on my actual developer hat. I love stack traces. Okay.
Stack traces, yeah.
Awesome.
Well, you might be snarky with that, but trust me, stack traces might be better than the alternative. So we did find out that the username was null, and that's why the failure was happening. But we were also able to climb the stack here and say, well, that happened in the user repository, which was called by the user service, which was called by the eligibility service, which was called by the controller. We were able to go all the way back up that stack to find out the path of the error with that stack trace. Okay? With 1 app log entry, we were able to do that. Why? Because the stack trace has the visibility of everything inside the monolith. All right? Now let's do the same thing over here in the API gateway. We call the eligibility microservice. It comes through, fails on the repository layer, and this is what you see. I want you to notice that the only thing that it has here is the repository layer. Actually, I think somebody changed this. All right. Anyway, yeah, these should all say repository, I believe, right? Anyway, the reason why is because the stack trace only has, sorry, that was correct. The stack trace only has the visibility for the current microservice. All right, so that's why it doesn't even know where it originated at that point. So all context from the previous microservice is lost. All right, and then we have to step in with.
So we have to have a way to solve this, right? Like my developers need to be able to look at a full stack trace so that we can debug issues.
Don't worry, boss. I got you covered.
Okay.
All right, and we're going to go fast right now. So, way back about 10 years ago, maybe, Google came out with a paper called Dapper that foresaw this problem with microservices. They didn't actually implement anything yet. They just came up with a paper that said you're going to need some sort of distributed tracing if you're going to have a very distributed system like this. Then the first person to come out with something was Twitter with their Zipkin. And then we came out with something called Money. It isn't used much. I actually would not, it's open source, but don't, never mind. And, it works well for us. That's all I got to say. And then they recently came out with Open Telemetry, which is probably going to be the new hotness for distributed tracing. Okay, and if you want to talk to the right, he's real good. Paul Clare is good. It just he moved on to another thing, and okay, all right. So
He's amazing.
Yeah, he's amazing. So we used to use distributed tracing to track transactions across applications. Now we need to track transactions within a single application because everything's distributed now. That's Captain Rodriguez who said that. All right, I'm going to just go through if you don't mind. Okay, so how does it look? How do we actually track application problems in a microservices world? So something comes into the API gateway, and at that moment, you give it a correlation ID. If you put this in production, I would not recommend you start with the number 1. All right? So when it goes to the eligibility endpoint, at that point, when you log in there, you log that correlation ID along in your logs. Okay? Then when it does its processing, every time you log something, you should put that correlation ID in there. Then if something goes wrong and you do get that final stack trace that doesn't know anything about the previous path, you have this correlation where you can actually draw out what happened the whole time. So, as you can see though, where you had 1 app log before with the single stack trace, now you have 7 in order to get the same information. Okay? And over time, and this is a very conservative estimate, you could have 4 times as much the log file size if you're not careful when you move to microservices. Okay. I'm going to just keep going because of time. All right, here we go. So, what you used to do for 1 in the monolith, you now have to do for many. What do I mean by that? This was a real spreadsheet that I put together for that same boss to let them know that when we used to have 1 monolith, this is all of our parts that work together. In a second, we'll talk what those are. Basically, all you need to know are greens across the board. All right? But then all the other parts, when you started moving to microservices, we were kind of just so enthralled in moving to microservices that we weren't checking all the boxes of the things that needed to get done. For example, this area had to do with code review and continuous integration. We were instead just dropping WAR files and jar files onto the server in the beginning, okay? Continuous deployment to all environments with automated testing, okay? We were like, we'll get to that later. Firewalls and observability, huge, right? Because before you used to be able to just talk in between in one service. Now you might actually have a firewall problem just talking to another piece of the microservice. So, and then security scans were something that we had in place, and we had to basically set that up, these vulnerability scans. So my suggestions would be, do not create all your microservices at once. Yesterday, Scott Pruitt had mentioned the strangler pattern. Go with it, man. It's an awesome way to strangle the monolith and move over to microservices 1 at a time, okay? How do you decide which ones to take care of first? Maybe you want to monitor the usage and find your most utilized endpoints and then prioritize in that way as far as moving to microservices. Okay, and then have a template for your microservices. Something that every developer doesn't have to start from scratch every single time they want to create a new microservice. That way everybody kind of knows a starting point. Okay, the change management team wants their release notes. Okay, this is an important thing if you still have change management team. Things got so crazy that we had to write our applications and we automated our release notes. And I want to just go over the parts that we had to come up with there. So when we checked our code in, basically we had to have something that automated this section of our release notes, which laid out every single microservice that we had and said, here's a link to the test for that microservice, here's a link to the Jenkins job that's going to deploy that microservice, the Veracode security scans that we were doing at the time, here's our score for the security scans, and here's our method that we use to roll back. Those were all things that needed to be satisfied by the change control board before we were allowed to roll out. Okay, some people would say just get rid of the change control board. We just satisfied them with an automated report. All right. Version control and compatibility, very important to think about because we ran into this issue. In one particular release, this might be what your list of microservices looks like, okay? Now a release is no longer completely tied to the version of the binary file that you have. Now a release is an aggregation of all your microservice versions, okay? And those versions of each microservice can all move independently from each other. So it's really tough to keep track of over time. We ran into it when we basically sold all of our code to Charter, and Charter said, you know what, we want the version of your code from November of last year. And I said, good luck. You know, we had to go back and find out what code was checked in at that time, what was the version of the particular code. It was not easy, it was not ugly. And finally we get to the thing that you care about. Burnout is real, all right? You mind if I stress this point real quick?
You do it.
All right, this is the lesson we did learn. We did have a lot of people. We were under a lot of tight deadlines at Xfinity Mobile. We had not yet released to production, and we had deadlines. And at that same time, we decided we were going to go from a monolith to microservices. So the World Health Organization has recently said that this is an actual condition, so you could look it up. And I don't want to belabor that point, but try not to overwork your people. All right, so let's end with some do's and don'ts. Do you want the do's or the don'ts?
Actually, I'd like to add just a couple things.
Sure.
To really drive it home here. Number one is, one of the great things about moving to microservices is how highly unit testable and automated testable they are. Because it really is separating any of your front end from your business logic. So that's going to get you to speedier deployments, because you can actually depend on the unit tests that your people are writing as they're writing these microservices to make sure that they are going out with quality. The other thing that I would like to stress about moving to microservices is that it also enables people to, again, with the separation of the front end from the business logic, it enables people to really focus on a core area of expertise. And it is important to think about microservices as something that does employ business logic. So if you have a data service that you're hitting that's giving you every piece of data that you need, and you don't need to munge it or do a union on it, then perhaps that's not a great rationale for a microservice. But when you are hitting multiple data services and having to employ your own business logic on top, that's the sweet spot for using a microservice.
Agreed. All right, in 20 seconds, I'm going to tell you. Do have a reason to move to microservices, maybe resilience or cost optimization. Don't practice resume-driven development, all right? Do have a plan for monitoring telemetry and distributed tracing. Don't count on traditional logging techniques. Do peel off one microservice at a time. Try the triangular application pattern. Don't refactor everything at once. Do understand that all the teams are impacted. QA, release management, you're not in a vacuum. Don't say we're doing microservices YOLO. All right. Do staff appropriately and monitor employee health. Don't ignore the human impact of your decision. And, sorry, I'm going to go back in case you guys want a picture. All right, and the last one, do encourage DevOps teams to pursue microservices if there are benefits, and don't underestimate the time, effort, and money involved. Thank you, everybody.